Section 4 of Little Journeys to the Homes of English Authors. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of English Authors by Elbert Hubbard. Section 4. Robert Browning, Part 2. Robert Browning awoke one morning with a start. It was the morning of his 30th birthday. One's 30th birthday and one's 70th are days that press their message home with iron hand. With his 70th milestone passed, a man feels that his work is done, and dim voices call to him from across the unseen. His work is done, and so illy compared with what he had wished and expected. But the impressions made upon his heart by the day are no deeper than those his 30th birthday inspires. At 30, youth, with all its palliates and excuses, is gone for ever. The time for mere fooling is past. The young avoid you, or else look up to you as a Nestor, and tempt you to grow reminiscent. You are a man, and must give an account of yourself. Out of the stillness came a voice to Robert Browning, saying, "What hast thou done with the talent I gave thee?" What had he done? It seemed to him at the moment as if he had done nothing. He arose and looked in the mirror. A few grey hairs were mixed in his beard, there were crow's feet on his forehead, and the first joyous flush of youth had gone from his face for ever. He was a bachelor, inwardly at war with his environment, but making a bold front with his twopence worth of philosophy to conceal the unrest within. A bachelor of 30, strong in limb, clear in brain, and yet a dependent. No one but himself to support, and couldn't even do that. Gadzooks! Fie upon all poetry, and a plague upon this dumb, dense, shop-keeping, beer-drinking nation, upon which the sun never sets. The father of Robert Browning had done everything a father could. He had supplied board and books, and given his son an allowance of £1 a week for 10 years. He had sent him on a journey to Italy, and published several volumes of the young man's verse at his own expense, and these books were piled high in the garret, save a few that had been bought by charitable friends or given away. Robert Browning was not discouraged. Oh no, not that. Only the world seemed to stretch out in a dull, monotonous grey, where once it was green, the colour of hope, and all decked with flowers. The little literary world of London knew Browning and respected him. He was earnest and sincere, and his personality carried weight. His face was not handsome, but his manner was one of poise and purpose, and to come within his aura and look into his calm eyes was to respect the man and make obeisance to the intellect that you felt lay behind. A few editors had gone out of their way to discover him to the world, but their lavish reviews fell flat. Buyers would not buy. No one seemed to want the wares of Robert Browning. He was hard to read, difficult, obscure, or else there wasn't anything in it at all. They didn't know which. Fox, editor of the Repository, had met Browning at the Flowers and liked him. He tried to make his verse go, but couldn't. Yet he did what he could, and insisted that Browning should go with him to the Sunday evenings at Barry Cornwall's. There Browning met Leigh Hunt, Monckton Milnes, and Dickens. Then there were dinner parties at Sergeant Talfourd's, where he got acquainted with Wordsworth, Walter Savage Landor, and Macready. Macready impressed him greatly, and he impressed Macready. he gave the actor a copy of Paracelsus, one of the pile in the garret, and Macready suggested he write a play. Strafford was the result, and we know it was stillborn, and caused a very frosty feeling to exist for many a year between the author and the actor. When a play fails, the author blames the actor, and the actor damns the author. These men were human. Of course, Browning's kinsmen all considered him a failure, and when the father paid over the weekly allowance, he often rubbed it in a bit. Lizzie Flower had modified her prophecy as to the laureateship, but was still loyal. They had tiffed occasionally, and broken off the friendship, and once, I believe, returned letters. To marry was out of the question. He couldn't support himself, and besides that, they were old, demnation old. He was past 30, and she was 40. Gramercy! They tiffed, then they made up. In the meantime, Browning had formed a friendship, very firm and frank, but strictly platonic, of course, for Fanny Haworth. Miss Haworth had seen more of the world than Miss Flower. She was an artist, a writer, and moved in the best society. Browning and Miss Haworth wrote letters to each other for a while, most every day, and he called on her every Wednesday and Saturday evening. Miss Haworth bought and gave away many copies of Pauline, Sordello, and Paracelsus, and informed her friends that Pippa Passes and Two in a Gondola were great quality. About this time we find Edward Moxon, the publisher, who married the adopted daughter of Charles and Mary Lamb, saying to Browning, "Your verse is all right, Browning, but a book of it is too much. People are appalled. They cannot digest it, and when it goes into a magazine it is lost in the mass. Now just let me get out your work in little monthly instalments, in booklet form, and I think it will go." Browning jumped at the idea. The booklets were gotten out in paper covers, and offered at a moderate price. They sold, and sold well. The literary elite bought them by the dozen to give away. People began to talk about Browning. He was getting a foothold. His royalties now amounted to as much as the weekly allowance from his father, and Pater was talking of cutting off the stipend entirely. Finances being easy, Browning thought it a good time to take another look at Italy. Some of the best things he had written had been inspired by Venice and Asolo. He would go again, and so he engaged a passage on a sailing ship for Naples. Shortly after Browning's return to London in 1844, he dined at Sergeant Talfourd's. After the dinner, a well-dressed and sprightly old gentleman introduced himself, and begged that Browning would inscribe a copy of Bells and Pomegranates that he had gotten specially bound. There is an ancient myth about writers being harassed by autograph fiends and all that. But the simple fact is, nothing so warms the cockles of an author's heart as to be asked for his autograph. Of course Browning graciously complied with the gentleman's request, and in order that he might insert the owner's name in the inscription, asked, "What name, please?" And the answer was, "John Kenyon." Then Mr. Browning and Mr. Kenyon had a nice little visit, talking about books and art, and Mr. Kenyon told Mr. Browning that Miss Elizabeth Barrett, the poetess, was a cousin of his. He was a bit boastful of the fact, and Mr. Browning nodded and said he had often heard of her and admired her work. Then Mr. Kenyon suggested that Mr. Browning write and tell her so. "You see, she has just gotten out a new book, and we are all a little nervous about how it is going to take." Miss Barrett lives in a darkened room, you know, sees no one, and a letter from a man like you would encourage her greatly." Mr. Kenyon wrote the address of Miss Barrett on a card and pushed it across the table. Mr. Browning took the card, put it in his pocket-book, and promised to write Miss Barrett, as Mr. Kenyon requested. And he did. Miss Barrett replied, Mr. Browning answered, and soon several letters a week were going in each direction. Not quite so many missives were being received by Fanny Haworth, and as for Lizzie Flower, I fear she was quite forgotten. She fell into a decline, drooped, and died in a year. Mr. Browning asked for permission to call on Miss Barrett. Miss Barrett explained that her father would not allow it, neither would the doctor or nurse, and added, "There is nothing to see in me. I am a weed, fit for the ground and darkness." But this repulse only made Mr. Browning want to see her the more. He appealed to Mr. Kenyon, who was the only person allowed to call, besides Miss Mitford. Mr. Kenyon was her cousin. Mr. Kenyon arranged it. He was an expert at arranging anything of a delicate nature. He timed the hour when Mr. Barrett was down-town, and the nurse and doctor safely out of the way, and they called on the invalid prisoner in the darkened room. They did not stay long, but when they went away, Robert Browning trod on air. The beautiful girl-like face, in its frame of dark curls, lying back among the pillows, haunted him like a shadow. He was 33, she was 35. She looked like a child, but the mind, the subtle, appreciative, receptive mind, the mind that caught every allusion, that knew his thought before he voiced it, that found nothing obscure in his work, and that put a high and holy construction on his every sentence. It was divine, divinity incarnated in a woman. Robert Browning tramped the streets, forgetful of meat, drink, or rest. He would give this woman freedom. He would devote himself to restoring her to the air and sunshine. What nobler ambition! He was an idler. He had never done anything for anybody. He was only a killer of time, a vagrant, but now was his opportunity. He would do for this beautiful soul what no one else on earth could do. She was slipping away as it was. The world would soon lose her. Was there none to save? Here was the finest intellect ever given to a woman, so sure, so vital, so tender, and yet so strong. He would love her back to life and light. And so Robert Browning told her all this shortly after. But before he told, she had divined his thought, for solitude and loneliness and heart-hunger had given her the power of an astral being. She was in communication with all the finer forces that pervade our ether. He would love her back to life and light. He told her so. She grew better. And soon we find her getting up and throwing wide the shutters. It was no longer the darkened room, for the sunlight came dancing through the apartment, driving out all the dark shadows that lurked therein. The doctor was indignant, the nurse resigned. Of course, Mr. Barrett was not taken into confidence, and no one asked his consent. Why should they? He was the man who could never understand. So one fine day, when the coast was clear, the couple went over to St. Marylebone Church and were married. The bride went home alone, could walk all right now, and it was a week before her husband saw her, because he would not be a hypocrite and go ring the door-bell and ask if Miss Barrett was home. And of course, if he had asked for Mrs. Robert Browning, no one would have known whom he wanted to see. But at the end of a week the bride stole down the stairs while the family was at dinner, leading her dog Flush by a string, and all the time with throbbing heart she prayed the dog not to bark. I have oft wondered, in the stilly night season, what the effect on English letters would have been had the dog really barked. But the dog did not bark, and Elizabeth met her lover husband there on the corner where the mailbox is. No one missed the runaways until the next day, and then the bride and groom were safely in France, writing letters back from Dieppe, asking forgiveness and craving blessings. "She is the genius, and I am the clever person," Browning used to say, and this, I believe, will be the world's final judgment. Browning knew the world in its every phase, good and bad, high and low, society and commerce, the shop and gypsy camp. He absorbed things, assimilated them, compared and wrote it out. Elizabeth Barrett had never travelled, her opportunities for meeting people had been few, her experiences limited. And yet she evolved truth. She secreted beauty from within. For 2 years after their elopement they did not write. How could they? Goodness me! They were on their wedding tour. They lived in Florence and Rome, and in various mountain villages in Italy. Health came back, and joy and peace and perfect love were theirs. But it was joy bought with a price. Elizabeth Barrett Browning had forfeited the love of her father. Her letters written him came back unopened. Books inscribed to him were returned. He declared she was dead. Her brothers, too, discarded her, and when her 2 sisters wrote, they did so by stealth, and their letters, meant to be kind, were steel for her heart. Then her father was rich, and she had always known every comfort that money could buy. Now she had taken up with a poor poet, and every penny had to be counted. Absolute economy was demanded, and Robert Browning, with a certain sense of guilt upon him for depriving her of all the creature comforts she had known, sought by tenderness and love to make her forget the insults her father heaped upon her. As for Browning the bank clerk, he was vexed that his son should show so little caution as to load himself up with an invalid wife, and he cut off the allowance, declaring that if a man was old enough to marry, he was old enough to care for himself. He did, however, make his son several loans, and finally came to bless the day that his son had sense enough to marry the best and most talented woman on earth. Browning's poems were selling slowly, and Mrs. Browning's books brought her a little royalty, thanks to the loyal management of John Kenyon. And so absolute want and biting poverty did not overtake the runaways. After the birth of her son in 1849, Mrs. Browning's health seemed to have fully returned. She used to ride horseback up and down the mountain passes, and wrote home to Miss Mitford that love had turned the dial backward, and the joyousness of girlhood had come again to her. When John Kenyon died and left them £10,000 all their own, it placed them for ever beyond the apprehension of want, and also enabled them to do for others, for they pensioned old Water Savage Landor and established him in comfortable quarters around the corner from Casa Guidi. I intimated a moment ago that their honeymoon continued for 2 years. This was a mistake, for it continued for just 15 years, when the beautiful girl-like form, with her head of flowing curls upon her husband's shoulder, ceased to breathe. Painlessly and without apprehension or premonition, the spirit had taken its flight. The letter of Miss Blagden's, written some weeks after, telling of how the stricken man paced the echoing hallways at night, crying, "I want her! I want her!" touches us like a great strange sorrow that once pierced our hearts. But Robert Browning's nature was too strong to be subdued by grief. He remembered that others too had buried their dead, and that sorrow had been man's portion since the world began. He would live for his boy, for her child. But Florence was no longer his Florence, and he made haste to settle up his affairs and go back to England. He never returned to Florence, and never saw the beautiful monument designed by his lifelong friend, Frederick Leighton. When you visit the little English cemetery at Florence, the slim little girl that comes down the path swinging the big bunch of keys opens the high iron gate and leads you without word or question straight to the grave of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Browning was 49 when Mrs. Browning died, and by the time he reached his 50th meridian, England, hearkening to America's suggestion, was awakening to the fact that he was one of the world's great poets. Honours came slowly but surely. Oxford with a degree, St. Andrews with a Lord Rectorship, publishers with advance payments. And when Smith and Elder paid £100 for the poem of Hervé Riel, it seemed that at last Browning's worth was being recognized. Not, of course, that money is the infallible test, but even poetry has its Rialto, where the extent of appreciation is shown by prices current. Browning's best work was done after his wife's death, and in that love he ever lived and breathed. In his 75th year it filled his days and dreams as though it were a thing of yesterday, singing in his heart a perpetual Eucharist. The Ring and the Book must be regarded as Browning's crowning work. Off-hand critics have disposed of it, but the great minds go back to it again and again. In the character of Pompilia, the author sought to pay tribute to the woman whose memory was ever in his mind, yet he was too sensitive and shrinking to fully picture her. He sought to mask his inspiration, but tender, loving recollections of Bar were interlaced and interwoven through it all. When Robert Browning died in 1889, the world of literature and art uncovered in token of honour to one who had lived long and well, and had done a deathless work. And the doors of storied Westminster opened wide to receive his dust. End of section 4